I'm working through this book called Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. And it's an amazing book because it condenses down centuries of Buddhist polemics and maybe you call it philosophy and discussion about what emptiness means. And it condenses it all down into 5 main stages, which can be seen not as historical polemics between different schools, but as stages in a progressive understanding of what emptiness means in the Buddhist context. Famous teaching about, I think everybody kind of hears about this teaching, famous teaching of the Buddha teaching about not self, or even no self. Does anybody think the Buddha taught there's no self? Or anybody heard that the Buddha taught there's no self? Yes, I think there's plenty of that around. So what is this? What is this business? What is this? What gets liberated then? Who gets liberated? What does liberation mean? What the Buddha insisted on was he wasn't teaching about philosophical views. Now this isn't, I'm not competing with all you great philosophers because there were plenty around at the time. He said, I teach suffering and the cessation of suffering. That's all I'm interested in. So he's not going to kind of solve this question and say, yes, there is a self, or no, there isn't a self, or yes, there's both a self and not a self, or any other kind of combination of view that you might come up with. He's going to teach us what's the cause of suffering and the ending of suffering, the cessation of suffering. Practice and examine our experience for ourselves and follow that through so that we can also find what he found, which is the cessation of suffering. So what has that got to do with self or not self? And I think it's immediately obvious to all of us that when you become very egocentric and selfish and very concerned about yourself, to the exclusion of others, to the exclusion of a bigger picture, your suffering increases. Plus the fact your actions are such that they cause other people's suffering to increase. And that then leads to a knock-on effect that their suffering causes your suffering to increase. The problem is I'm attached to myself. And I know that, and that's probably what's drawn me here to Buddhism. I want to give that up. I want to give up my clinging to self, or maybe even I'd like to get rid of myself. I'm a nuisance to the world. It would be better, the world would be better without me. I need to get rid of me. So, there isn't me. Oh, then maybe that's good news. Ego is really conceit, isn't it? You have this conceit, you have this kind of big idea of me, mine, this is me. Whether it's, this is me, this terrible person, or this, I'm the worst, or I'm as good as the next person, or I'm probably better than everybody, really, but I better not say so, shouldn't think that, but all these versions of ego conceit are very, if you start to notice that, and what that's all about, quite a lot of it you can just drop yourself because you can see it's ridiculous. And then there's the rest of it, which is ridiculous, but you still can't drop it. And this is really, we can't drop it because we've established such a strong habit of clinging on to all these notions of what I am and who I am and, all this ego stuff, you might call it. So this teaching on not self is designed to cut through all of that, but it cuts even deeper. It cuts really to the quick. In a sense, you're systematically going through everything that you could identify with and think is yourself, look at it for what it is, and realise actually it's not. So even just a simple thing like somebody telling you your thoughts are not yourself. You're having these terrible thoughts and you think, I'm such a terrible person, I'm having such terrible thoughts. And then somebody says, well, your thoughts aren't you. Anybody could say that, couldn't they? Even a child might be able to tell you that. That's already a huge step, isn't it? Away from completely identifying with your thoughts as being yourself, or your feelings as being yourself, or your body as being yourself. So there's the first skandha is the body, or form. There's a bit of discussion about that. Then there's the mind, which is made up of feelings, perceptions, let's call them formations, because that's how they're listed in the Heart Sutra. But there's a lot of discussion about that one too. And then there's consciousness. And these are all described as heaps. They're not unitary. They're all the elements that make up the body, all the elements that make up the feelings, all the elements that make up the perceptions, all the elements that make up the formations, all the things that are going on in your mind, and all the elements that go to make up consciousness. So these are not unitary by any accounts. So you need to look to see if that's true or not. Don't take my word for it. Don't even take the Buddha's word for it. Just have a look and see. Is there one single thing that is your body, or is it actually made of a whole heap of stuff? And is any of that stuff? Can you isolate any of that stuff as anything? And is any of that stuff me? Actually, so with the body, you could sort of think, well, it's not me because it's changing all the time, isn't it? So it's not me because when I die, it'll just go. It won't be there anymore. Question still remains, well, will I still be there? So I don't mean me. When I say me, I don't mean my body, because I think I might still be there when my body's gone. To even be able to formulate that question means that I'm not thinking I am my body. Am I my feelings? I don't like certain feelings, so I don't like it. So it's not me, is it? Because I want to get rid of it. It's something that I'd like to get rid of. I'd like to exist without it. So obviously I'm not it, or I wouldn't even think in those terms. And then the same with perceptions. We become very attached, actually, to our perceptions as being what defines us. That I see things in a certain way. That's my world. That's it's terrible to find out you're wrong about anything, isn't it? Like your whole world falls apart. Like that's not blue. It's red. What? It's red. No, it's not. It's blue. No, it's red. It's blue, isn't it? No, it's red. It's blue, isn't it? No, it's red. What? It's like my whole... Well, who am I then? What am I then if I can't even see what everybody else can see? So, and yet, I'm still me. Even if my perceptions are completely different from anyone else's, I'm still me. So my perceptions aren't me, even though I'm so kind of disturbed if there's any suggestion that my perceptions are not what I think they are. And the same with all the more complicated mental events that are going on. We talk about perceptions as if they're kind of a momentary thing. That's an object appears, maybe visual, or hear it, or you smell it, and it's there, and then you know it, and that's kind of a perception. But actually, underneath the perception, there's a whole load of attitudes and habits of mind, habits of thinking, that make that perception what it is, isn't it? There's always much more going on. And that you kind of, when you're sitting in meditation, sometimes you can see all that going on, can't you? Sort of layer upon layer of stuff that create our world. But that can all change. There's none of it that can't change, and I would still be me, but I'd have different stuff going on, but I'd still be me. So there's that constant sense that you're chasing something that's going a bit faster than you. I can't catch up with it, and if I did catch up with it, would I know it? And then just kind of keep working with it, keep sort of worrying away at it until it starts to open up. So then Khenpo Rinpoche, in his book, The Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness, what's he doing in there? So he tells us to look for a permanent, single and independent self. And so supposing you've been dreaming of fighting somebody off, or you're being drowned, or you're being chased, or whatever it is, or you've just done some terrible crime and you're feeling terrible about it, and then you wake up and you find, oh, I'm not being chased. I didn't do that. Phew. So you dissociate. You can see how your mind has actually been able to create something that's completely untrue. And that self in that dream is not yourself. So then he doesn't tell you to analyze it any further. He tells you now, noticing that the skandhas are not the self, now just relax your mind. Don't analyze anymore. Just relax into the space of your awareness. Which, is quite a jump. If you can do that, well done. But it's quite interesting that he doesn't get into any kind of there's a self or not self. Only it's like a dream and an illusion, and you know how to treat a dream and an illusion. We naturally know how to treat a dream or an illusion. We know how to see it's not real, and not to take it, not to take it seriously. We know how to not take it seriously. We know how to, step into another space where that isn't true. Which I think is a really interesting way of meditating. But it does have a certain danger to it, because we tend to do more than he's told us to do, and we tend to think that's our view. We take it as a view, everything's like a dream and an illusion. And then it becomes quite nihilistic, because it means everything's not really real and doesn't really matter, including everybody else. So it could be a way of distancing yourself from your experience, couldn't it? Oh, don't worry about it, it's just like a dream, sort of swatting away, your experience and not really allowing it to speak to you. Which he isn't telling you to do that. He's telling you to do this, to let go of your clinging to self-importance, really, and all your hopes and fears concerning what isn't actually you. So it's really to help you really relax the mind. Yeah. I think if you practice like this, you can be very shocked to realise so much of what we think we're suffering is actually just our own drama. And it's just like a dream. It has no more significance than last night's dream. And you could, if you were to die and just be able to meditate like that, you could leave everything behind without any attachment, which would be great. It would certainly be better than all the grasping we would do otherwise. So, as long as you don't take this one too far, and he's got the 5 views there, this is just the first one. So it's a way of practicing not self. So when you come to the Mahayana, it calls the Shravaka view, it has this name, Shravaka view, and that Shravaka view is, same as in Rinpoche's book, not self of the person. And we need to realize not self of the person. So that removes the klesha veils, greed, hate and delusion, because you see that the self you were clinging to is not yourself. You stop clinging to that, then you don't then grasp out of greed, hate and delusion, pride, envy and jealousy and so on. You're free from all that grasping to the self, as a self that isn't yourself. But then the Mahayana Sutras introduce this idea that there's, to remove the knowledge veils in order to realize the Buddha's great compassion, you have to remove you have to realize the not self of the Dharmas. They tend to say the Dharmas have no self-nature. But then this scholastic view seems to get in there and turn it back again into that view that the self is causes and conditions by introducing this idea of samvriti satya, or what's usually translated as relative truth. So they introduce this idea that actually causes and conditions are relative truth, or samvriti satya, and everything that's samvriti satya is impermanent and changing and conditioned. And this is what the self is. It's relative truth and it's causes and conditions, which then you've gone back to what I said was the scholastic view, which the Buddha said was one of the Sakkaya Drishti, one of the wrong views. So, sure enough, the Tathagata Sutras come in, trying again to get back to what the Buddha said, saying that the highest refuge, a term they use for the highest refuge is self. They use it the way the Buddha was, and insist, as the Buddha did, that any clinging to any views, such as there is a self or there isn't a self, is missing the point. In other words, clinging to views that the self is conditioned, impermanent and changing is a view and to be abandoned, as is clinging to the view that the self exists. So the Tathagata Sutras come in with that very strongly, again trying to attack that scholastic view. So it moves from what it's called the Shravaka view of not self of the person to what it calls not self of the Dharmas, in which it reiterates that Dharmas are not the self because they have no self-nature, and Nirvana is peace because it is beyond all clinging to views. It sounds very complicated because that's just about 2,500 years of historical commentarial tradition being reduced back to its origin, and that the scholars, because they set up some scholastic system in which they some of it got out of touch with the yogic tradition, the meditation tradition. It went a bit skew-riff, and so the meditation tradition keeps coming back in to try and put it right again. And you can see this happening in every Buddhist tradition, actually, and in the Tibetan, different schools in Tibetan Buddhism, in Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism. I shouldn't say Indian Buddhism. Well, maybe you could. But also the Theravadan tradition. You've got the forest monk tradition, which teach the same way we teach, and the scholastic tradition teaches the same way as the various scholastic traditions in other countries have made the same movement into thinking the self is impermanent and changing and conditioned. Which then, if that's the case, what gets liberated? You turn it into a kind of rationalistic system without any spark to it, really. And I'm noticing more and more that people who've been trying to practice with that view for a long time eventually get this sense that this is nihilistic, this isn't what I joined, this isn't what I signed up for. But it's interesting how for a long time it can be quite satisfying, and I think it's because it's so effective at cutting through what I usually cling to as myself, and that automatically brings some relief to our suffering. But if then we don't have any further pointers beyond that, it becomes like, so what? We don't really care what the school's taught. What we want to know is what is true about my own experience and what's the significance and meaning of emptiness. And that sounds terribly technical, but actually it's pretty straightforward. How do we experience ourselves as a person? Well, we experience our body, first skandha. We experience our feelings, second skandha. We experience our perceptions, third skandha. We experience our different patterns of mind formations, things going on in our minds. That's the fourth skandha, and then a kind of overall sense of consciousness of all of that, which is the fifth skandha. What is that relationship between the mind and what the mind knows as knowledge? The big danger, and I think this is a big danger that Western philosophers have been aware of over the centuries and quite worried by, is what's called solipsism, which is ending up thinking there's only me. It's only me and my experience. And I mean, there's something quite terrible about such a thought, isn't there? It's all quite scary stuff, isn't it? So what is the mind? And how does it... How do we rescue it from nihilism, really? You know, that I think solipsism is a kind of nihilism, isn't it? It's a kind of meaninglessness. But on the other hand, I've raised this question many times already, I think. How do we know that there are other beings? How do we know that there's another... You know, we know our own experience, but how do we know that that isn't just a complex, delusion that there's other beings? And obviously if we met someone who was like that, we'd consider them completely mad. Certainly their life would be meaningless, and, So there's something about how we know there's other beings that is not... We don't reach it through a logical, analytical means. It comes very directly, because it brings with it a sense of meaning and joy and purpose and everything that we're looking for that isn't suffering. I mean, okay, other beings also bring us suffering one way or another, but they're integral to what it is to be a being. There's other beings. I think it's really important to note that our whole meaning of our life really is based on something that isn't something we analyse and work out logically. But to be a reasonable, rational human being, you have to have a very strong element of intuitive sense of others. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that when we're talking in a scientific world, as if you could measure everything and we do everything totally rationally and logically. Actually, the most important things we do in our life, we can't analyse and can't do them in that way. We just do it because it's integral to what we are. To be rational is not to be stuck in your head. That would be a kind of madness. That would be a solipsistic kind of existence. So today I wanted to consider the statement of the Buddha that the three realms of existence. That's like the desire realms, like we're in, form realms, and the formless realms are only mind, are merely mind. And the next chapter is all about that. It's called Chittamatra, which means merely mind, only mind. It leaves the question open as to, well, then what are they? Or what is the material world, if you like? What is the body? What are the objects of the senses? You're looking at some thoughts arise in your mind. And a thought arises, and then sometimes you're given the instruction to look at the thought, to see its nature. And then when you try to look at the thought, you think, oh, I'm not sure if I'm looking at the thought or I'm looking at a second thought by means of which I'm trying to capture the first thought. Sort of very quickly you get complicated like that, don't you? We create, like with a dream, our mind has created the dream, but then it's done something more. It's actually become confused by the dream. It's taking it to be something that it isn't. And that's where the papancha come in. So both the dream that we're taking to be real when it isn't, and the mind that's taking it to be real when it isn't, is all papancha. It's kind of gets stuck. So the nature of mind beyond papancha is like what we're aiming for. But is that what the Buddha meant when he said the three realms are mere mind? And different Buddhist thinkers have answered that differently. All the different ways that it's been understood could be right up to a point. So there are different ways you could understand it, and that would sort of progressively become more subtle and more deep. So then there's a whole range of stuff, which I've called clarity here, which we also refer to as mind. So when, the creative faculty of conceptually modelling things, you could say that's perception. When we perceive something, there's an intelligence there, isn't there? You could call it intelligence even. There's an intelligence there that can recognise that, can remember, can put together all the associations, can, sort of manipulate it in the mind, like if you're planning. You can actually have a concept in your mind, you can move it around, you can think, you can plan, you can calculate, you can assess and measure. It's wonderful things, and then it can get quite creative. So all these things I've mentioned here, including memory, all of that's mind, isn't it? What else is it? We don't have any other classification for it, really, do we? So when I think, for example, I am my body, so I get really upset, when I'm faced with the death of my body. It's like facing my death, because I have a vikalpa, which is the same as a papancha in a way, but it's more, it's perhaps less subtle. I have the idea that this body is me. So I've really identified very strongly with this body as me, or it could be, it could be my dignity or something. It's me, and so I really do indignant because that was me. Oh, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. That's not me. Kind of. That's a vikalpa, because I'm really taking that as real. You could say, well, it is real in a way, yeah, but the way I'm taking it is I'm just sort of holding on to an idea that I don't need to hold on to, so therefore it's not me, really. But I'm treating it as if it were. To take birth as me in this world at this time, with all my characteristics, and this is my personality, and this is me. That's what makes me believe that I've taken birth, because I put it all together in my mind and made it all into one thing that's me. And actually I've made that all up. It's all made up. You could say that's what all beings are doing, they're making it all up. There wouldn't be these 3 realms of samsara if beings didn't make this up. What would there be though? That's an interesting question, isn't it? When the Buddha says there is only mind, and if he meant it, there is only vikalpa, and some Buddhists think that's what he meant, then when there were no more vikalpa, there wouldn't be any more beings. But what would there be? Would there be anything? Is that what the Buddha's talking about? And what would enlightenment be? What would liberation be? What would be liberated? The 3 realms are only mind, merely mind. Then if you can understand that nature of mind when there's nothing manifesting and the nature of mind when something's manifesting, and you completely understand that, recognize that, and can remain awake during that process, you could understand everything, not just your own mind. But there isn't anything else. That gives you access to everything. Sometimes that's called omniscience or knowing all. It doesn't mean you know all in a kind of, grasp, got it all. It's like, not in a way, letting yourself not know anything, and then actually all the knowledge kind of flows through you. You're not, you're completely free to express what needs to be expressed at that time, because in a way there isn't any grasping. And if I start thinking about it, I get clumsy, find it difficult. So this is complete mastery, so you never have to think, because you've completely mastered, if you like, life itself. So you can do the most complex things with complete ease, because you're completely, you could say, one with reality or one with totality, or however you want to express it. So I've kind of taken you through the progression of stages of emptiness on the theme of progression of stages of understanding the nature of mind, because they parallel each other. And I've done that because I'm hoping it will make it easier to talk about what's happening in the next chapter. So we leave the Shravaka view with the impression that it only goes so far, and it doesn't actually include taking the step of recognizing that you can't really divide mind from matter. Mind and matter work together. If there was mind and there was matter that was separate, how could you know it? So it had to not be separate. I'm really convinced of that, just from my thinking. But then if it wasn't separate, was it all matter, which is quite a common view, isn't it, in the world these days? Or was it all mind? But then, either way, once you've said it's all one or the other, you've lost any meaning to talking about mind and matter in the first place. So why does it matter? Why does it matter? Why does it matter? What is the point? Don't mind. So from the point of view of the Mahayanists, they worried about the fact that matter was being put out there as something we didn't need to bother about, because we just kind of become liberated by recognizing everything's impermanent and changing, and then we become liberated from suffering, and that's it, that's the answer. And they think, hang on, that's kind of left too much out of the whole thing, and also it's a bit selfish, isn't it? You're just thinking about, you're recognizing that you're, liberated from your attachment. But actually, when you become liberated from your attachment, then your compassion grows. And when your compassion grows, then your concern for all beings grows. And then the question arises, well, what are all beings anyway? And if there's no distinction between, if you like, inside and outside, which is sort of similar to mind and matter, isn't it? Then you can't really distinguish all beings from, the liberation of all beings from your own liberation. Because I think, we all feel that, don't we? That I remember as a child, it was a very big concern of mine that I could go to heaven, but other people would go to hell. And not only that, I would know they were in hell. And I thought, well, that's not my idea of heaven, because if I know all those people are suffering, how can that doesn't satisfy me. I think many Christians are the same. They don't think that they're just going to abandon all beings because, I've gone to heaven. So with that same sort of sentiment, if I'm going to really realise what the Buddha realised, I have got to realise this question about what then is the whole of reality. And this question comes up then of, how do you know anything? Is there anything outside of mind? If there isn't anything outside of mind, then actually, when the Buddha says everything is merely mind, he means it ultimately, if you think you're separate from what you're seeing, you're already deluded. And they use some very interesting images. One of the images that comes up straight away is the beings of the three realms, when they are presented with what we would say was a glass of water. We would say that's a glass of water, it's for drinking. That's what our mind would tell us it was. A being in hell would see that as a cauldron of molten metal, and they would be, any contact with it would cause them tremendous suffering. That's how they're seeing it. And then another being would, like a fish, would think it's a nice place to live. I'll swim around in it. And then a god would see it as a vessel of amrita and sort of treasure it as something very special. And for many years, when I heard that described, I thought to myself, what are they talking about? I can understand, different beings in different realms seeing different things, but if there's something in the middle that is actually there, that they're all seeing differently, what is that? What is that thing that is actually there that they're all seeing differently? So I thought that was a fault with the image for a long time. I thought, well, that's not a very useful image. It doesn't make sense. But as the years rolled by and my understanding sort of became more, kind of came together more, I realised that this is exactly what it's saying. That there is a reality there. That perhaps, we can't grasp. So all the beings that are looking at reality and grasping at it see completely different things. But they are all looking at the same reality, if looking at reality is the right way of putting it. Because there is only, if you like, there is only this one reality, call it mind or call it matter. But there is only that one reality. Because then you've got mathematics, which is a good example of a reality that doesn't change, and yet everybody sees it differently. They see what's constructed from mathematics, but they don't see the mathematics, do they? I asked Wixing Shukpo once whether he thought that was what was being said. So was it mathematics? And he said, not exactly. There's more to it than that, but it's in that direction. So it's not philosophy, really. Like, philosophy is like, I suppose it depends what you mean by philosophy, but the idea that you can explain the nature of reality through ideas. Actually, this is anti-philosophy, because it's trying to show that you can't explain anything with ideas. But ideas, talking about the ideas we already have is a way of noticing how we hold on to our ideas, and it's our attachment to our ideas that causes suffering. So that's why it's worth looking more and more in detail about what the Buddhists are talking about when they talk about emptiness. What are the ideas that we already have? And how are we clinging on to them? How are we attached to them? And how does that attachment lead to suffering? And this is where meditation comes in. Because it's not philosophy, it's pointing out something about the way we think. And the way we think, there's a problem with it, because it leads to attachment. And the problem with attachment is it leads to suffering. So if we don't want to suffer, we've got to look at our attachment. And if we look at our attachment, we're going to see what the ideas are that we're clinging on to. And that goes back to the most basic assumptions that we're clinging on to. And to become liberated from those, well, first, you have to be in a state of mind where you're willing to let go of those attachments. So that requires a lot of preparatory work. And then even when you're willing to let go of those attachments, our habits of mind are so strong that it's very difficult to let go for more than just a fraction of a second. But even that's valuable. I mean, that is what we're going to have to go by for a long time. But the way we're going to become aware of this whole process is through meditation practice. And when I say meditation practice, I mean what the Tibetan word, what the Buddhist word for it is bhavana, which means we have to get used to it. And the way we get used to it is in sessions and breaks. So in the sessions we sit as still as we can, without any distractions as far as we can, so that we can really focus on what is going on in our mind and experience, be much, much more clear about it. So first that needs a certain amount of discipline to be able to focus our mind enough to be able to see what's happening. And then when we come out of the meditation practice, hopefully we've had some insights, and then to carry those over into our life and to see their relevance in terms of how we live our lives. So last time we were talking about the Chittamatra view, the mind-only school. So that the first stage was realising that the skandhas, that's our body and our mental processes, are impermanent and changing and are not self, because there's nothing there that isn't just changing all the time. So the next thing we looked at was the Chittamatra view, which was that it's kind of, actually the Chittamatra view is interesting. It really is, on the one side, really looking in more detail about what is mind anyway, what do we mean by consciousness, awareness, mind, and from quite an experiential point of view. And on the other side, like all Mahayana, it's a reaction to the Abhidharmist commentators. They kind of had this idea that, well, we're looking at the not self of the skandhas, and we're looking at the true nature of reality. We're looking at all these dharmas, these sort of the Abhidharma. What are the actual, if you like, elements of our experience? If you're going to look at your experience, what are all the elements? What are all the objects of the senses? What are all the senses? What are all the different kinds of emotion? What are the kind of different elements in the world, like the earth, air, fire, water? What are they made of? What's all of this made of? Trying to list it all, define it all, and say, this is what we Buddhists are about. This is what we've studied, and this is what we know, and we know about how this is all not self, and not to be attached to any of this, and therefore, and through that path, through that becoming awakened. But I think it's somehow or other that enterprise separated itself off from the actual process of meditation, so it became much more of a kind of intellectual, scholastic type exercise in many ways. Not entirely, these meditators were also interested. So that when the Mahayana came along, it was like almost as if the Abhidharmists were trying to define and say what truly existed, and therefore should be, was worthy of examination. And the Mahayanists thought, well, hang on, that whole enterprise is wrong, because you're trying to show what exists. When in fact, if you look carefully, you don't find anything exists. Well, not in the way we thought it did. And the Chittamatrans were saying, for example, and very importantly, we assume that the outside world exists, separate from, even though we've said, the skandhas are not the self, nonetheless, the outside world is different from the mind that knows it. I think we'd all go along with that. We couldn't make sense of the world at all if we didn't make that distinction, could we? But when you look closely, you can't see or know anything outside of the mind. And that's really the mind. That mind that's trying to do that is the mind that we're trying to wear out and give way to some other way of seeing, if you like. Our mind is trying all the time to complicate it, or elaborate it, or make something out of it. And because of that, we're confusing ourselves. And because we don't notice we're doing that, we succeed. And we have this very clear sense that there is inside and outside. That's one of the most fundamental ways that we make sense of our world. What would happen if you don't try to do any of that? You just stay very, very simple. So when something, you arise, something is an object of knowing, is known by the senses, you remain very simple and you don't try to grasp that there's an object that's outside or can be grasped by this grasping mind. That I just meditate without, to the best I can, to not let that happen. And what they found is actually free of that distinction. And that mind that's free from that distinction is luminous. It's knowing. It's, if you like, it's the essence of all our experience. It's all there. And then from that we then create this more complicated view of an inside and an outside, or seer and seen, subject and object. That we do that as it's an add-on. And before the complication there is what they call this pure mind, just pure mind. And they realised that if they were to keep practicing letting go of that complicating process of dividing inside and outside, self, other, or object, subject, object, if they didn't conceptually divide it, they just let it be as simple as they could, they were experiencing this clarity, and they called this a self-illuminating, self-knowing, self-illuminating mind. But they hadn't gone as far as the next step in the process of meditation. So when they thought about it, they still thought it must be going on moment by moment. So this must be momentary, moments of clarity. So you've got this problem of continuity. If it's really like that, if the past is really gone, future hasn't come, and this moment is very short, but then how does it join to the next one? To make a continuity. So they thought about it, and they thought a lot about all of this, and they came up with this term, the Alaya Vijnana, the ground consciousness, that somehow goes on, just keeps going. So that's always there, keeping it all together over time, and that somehow or other things are registered. So when something happens, when we do something, it gets registered in the Alaya Vijnana. But the mind itself, the Alaya Vijnana, and all the different sense consciousnesses and this clear light mind that would eventually become purified, that wasn't illusion, really. That was kind of real, but still momentary. They didn't get beyond that. So then, how do you get enlightened? How do you free this mind from this overlay of complication? Is you meditate on the emptiness of the mind, including all those things, the Alaya Vijnana and the sense consciousnesses and the clear light, and you specially meditate on how it is empty of the parakalpita, that within that mind there is no imagined things of subject and object that you've noticed are what cause all the complication. And by doing that, the clear light mind becomes more and more free and clear, and even more importantly, there's no attachment anymore, because you're not seeing things as separate that you're attached to. So, because you're not so attached, you don't suffer. And of course, any kind of fear or hatred or hostility, it all comes from attachment, doesn't it? Because if you weren't attached to yourself and attached to something that was threatening, you wouldn't be afraid of it. You wouldn't be opposed to it, because there wouldn't be any separation anyway. So all that complication then leads to the other kleshas, which then leads to suffering. So this is really the path to liberation. So that by meditating on the emptiness of the Paratantra, that's the Alaya Vijnana and all the mind parts of the mind, of this dichotomy, this separation of mind, subject and object, you actually purify the mind and arrive at liberation. So you should try it, so to see what happens. Especially this kind of mysteriousness of what kind of universe is. You and the universe are not separate and different entities. So both become quite different. don't they? The universe becomes quite different, and you become quite different. But what do you think you are? In a universe where we're not all separate, when you think of them, when they think of me, they wouldn't see me as separate. And when I think of them and don't think of them as separate, then we're not separate. That makes a huge difference, doesn't it? Well, there's a whole lot more I could say about that. I could run a whole series of talks on the Chittamatra, but I think it's would be good to move on to the next view, which is the Madhyamaka view. Madhyamaka is the middle way, and well, we all know that the Buddha always called his teaching the middle way, didn't he? And he always called it the teaching, the middle way between all views. He said, I don't, in a sense, what I'm talking about is the truth, not just a view. You have to go beyond views and open out to the truth. And this is very much what the Madhyamaka is stressing. So I would say it's very much going back to what the Buddha first said in the first place. Yes, it's the dropping of views. So they found fault with the Chittamatra view in the sense that they were saying, well, everything's mind, and that there is this mind, this self-illuminating, self-aware mind. And just as the Abhidharmists before had kind of been putting forward all these dharmas that truly existed and that could be become kind of a block. And the same with the Chittamatra view, having this idea that there is this Arya Vijnana and these different Vijnanas and these different minds and these different ways of being, and this mind that is going from moment to moment, this clear light mind that knows itself. These are all things that can be pinned down and described and understood, a kind of a system of some kind. They thought, well, actually, it can't be understood like that, because you take this clear light mind that's supposed to know itself. How can a mind know itself? A mind takes as knowledge an object of mind. How can it take its own self as its own object? That isn't possible. It doesn't make sense. So you can say, well, then what does make sense then? And actually, as long as you're trying to make sense of it with this other kind of mind, this mind that's trying to pin it down as something, as long as you're trying to do that, you are not going to get at how you know anything, for that matter. So this self-illuminating, self-knowingness, if you try to analyse it with your ordinary mind that's thinking in terms of time and space and, things are separate or whatever, any way you try to do that, you end up with contradictions. And it's a worthwhile discipline to go through that and see for yourself that you in your ordinary thinking mind can see for yourself that actually it leads to contradictions. So that was the main criticism against the Chittamatrins, that you couldn't have, if you like, a theory about everything's mind, because any view that you hold is a view, and is the conceptual mind still overworking, if you like, and you have to go towards that simplicity. And they all base themselves on a teacher called Nagarjuna, and he wrote something called the root verses, Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, the root verses of the Madhyamaka. And in those verses, he's basically attacking Abhidharma. He goes through all these, and in each verse he shows that one concept depends on another concept, and since these two concepts depend on each other, then whatever it is that you're talking about actually, in a sense, doesn't exist. You can't have dark without light. So dark doesn't exist without light. And light doesn't make any sense if there isn't dark. But there was a lot of argument about among the Madhyamakas about exactly what was the point that Nagarjuna was making. You got different kinds of Madhyamaka, people who say they were following Nagarjuna. So there was one lot called the Svatantrikas, and there was one lot called the Prasangikas. But what was happening with the Svatantrikas were they were very rigorous in following Nagarjuna and showing how, all the, you couldn't have, say you had a sense and a sense object, but the sense, like I've been just saying, the sense object depends on the sense. The moment of a sense depends on there being a sense object present, but if you've got the two moments arising separately in succession, there's no connection between them. If they arise together, then you wouldn't get any sense impression. So whichever way you looked at it, however perception was happening, it wasn't like that. So you can't really prove or establish that things, that the object appears before or after the consciousness of it, or together or separately. And it's quite argued quite strongly in some of the commentaries. You can't, and therefore they're not Demba Madrup, they're not established. Most translators say, well, they don't exist. But that doesn't make any sense, does it, to say nothing exists at all? I mean, even if something's an illusion, something exists, isn't it? There's something there that's knowing the illusion. There's something there that's causing the illusion. So these arguments go on endlessly, and as I said, philosophically they're not very interesting, but from the point of view of meditation, they are very interesting, because they bring you nearer and nearer to that mind that's trying to make it, and they think, so what else? What else is there in my experience? What other way of knowing? How am I actually living? Because I think I'm doing one thing which I'm not doing, but I'm still operational. So I must be doing it in a way I don't realise I'm doing it. I must be knowing in a way I don't realise I'm knowing. And so it actually opens something up. It's a very good discipline. So Madhyamaka is very important to all the Tibetan Buddhist schools. And I would say it's actually no different from what the Buddha said in the first place. I think this is the Buddhist middle way, of kind of going beyond all views. When you see that whatever view it is you adopt, it's not working, and yet you've not become dysfunctional. So none of these things exist, so you just rest in the emptiness. You could stay there for a while, just looking at that actually it does all disappear. Nothing that I thought was as it is, and as how I thought it was, it's all disappeared. And that can become a very, very strong experience. Very strong experience. Sometimes it just happens suddenly to people without them, sometimes when, I don't know, maybe it's some past, they've been practicing in the past and it comes up, or I think sometimes even when, people very stressed or, some, you're in balance, sometimes you can have very strong experiences of suddenly everything disappearing. It can be very scary. Well, very interesting. So that's Madhyamaka. Now, why do we have a separate Svatantrika and Prasangika Madhyamaka? So the Svatantrikas really stress that if you argue well, you can show that in the ultimate analysis, nothing exists. And then, if nothing exists, then there's a danger that we will think it doesn't matter what I do because nothing exists anyway. So that's quite a dangerous place to be. What they mean is nothing exists and is beyond all concepts. So, you can rest in that emptiness of concepts, but people might well understand it to mean, everything's empty, nothing exists, so it doesn't matter what I do. Yes, it does matter what you do. So there's this relative truth, or this seeming truth, or however you want to put it, which is the cause and effect that happens. If you plant seeds, you do get results. If you do a bad action, you will get a bad result. If you practice Dharma, you will get to enlightenment. Yes, there is cause and effect, even though ultimately it's all empty. So they put a lot of emphasis on these two truths, that you had to respect both truths. The truth that happens, works in your everyday life, and then this other truth, which is the ultimate reality. Whereas the Prasangikas were much more rigorously non-philosophical. They much more rigorously said, no, if you start coming up with these kind of ideas of there's relative truth that's relatively existent and absolute truth, absolute existence, you're just playing the same game again. You're still getting caught up in holding views. You've got two views now. You're holding one view, which is there's the absolute, and another view that there is the relative. And those are just views again. So, it's not, you've got to be much more rigorous and not have a view about the absolute and not have a view about the relative either. Doesn't mean you reject the relative. If you sort of say, cause and effects don't work, well, that's another view. So, cause and effects in terms of the world, they work in terms of the world. But I'm not saying that because they exist or they not exist or I hold any view about it. So, so then does that mean I can do whatever I like? Well, that would also be a view, wouldn't it? So, yeah, it's quite interesting. So if I think the relative... And I do notice some Buddhists do that. They sort of say, let's forget about this absolute truth thing. Let's just get on with the relative truth. We practical people, we're just interested in the relative truth. We're not interested in that airy-fairy absolute truth. Well, then there's no path to liberation, is there? That's kind of just like adopting a view of, I like this, I like thinking about practical things in the world and I don't like all this philosophical stuff. It's just views again. It's not, there's no reason why, if you're really seeing the true nature of reality, that you would lose interest in the practical world. Because that's inherently the nature of reality, so there wouldn't be any sense of losing interest in the practicalities of life. Even though sometimes it's practical to not get too involved in the practicalities of life. So there was a lot of argument about that. And that goes on to this day about what is the true Prasangika view. But also Madhyamaka, and this is the third kind of Madhyamaka. So we've got the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamaka, and then sometimes called Yogacara Madhyamaka, or using a Tibetan term, Shentong Madhyamaka. Final stage of progressive stages of meditation on emptiness. Shentong is a Tibetan word which means empty of other. Nice opaque kind of name for something. But it's very significant, and it's actually about Buddha nature, which perhaps makes you perk up a bit. That sounds more interesting, doesn't it? Buddha nature. Whatever that is. So this talk is the fifth stage, called Shentong. It is a form of Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka means middle way, really. So it's the middle way between existence, sort of the middle way between when we try to describe things, we describe them either as existing or not existing, or both or neither. But actually the way they are can't be grasped in that way. So they have to be known in another way. And this other way of knowing is what we need to discover. And this is why the Buddha's way is called the middle way, because that's what the Buddha taught. It's beyond any kind of philosophical view you can work out philosophically. You have to find this other way of knowing and know it directly through, conventionally we say meditation. You have to know it directly, almost as a revelation, as something that dawns on you. It's like and all the meditation traditions are playing around this edge of how do you find that? How do you find that other way that's not grasping at concepts and ideas and views, just letting go into, you could say, emptiness or spaciousness of experience or whatever. And you'll notice in the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness, the emphasis is on meditation, and that at the end of each chapter Rinpoche takes us back to the formless meditation, just having investigated and tried to understand the nature of your self or your mind or concepts. Just settle then and relax into meditating on the spaciousness of awareness itself. Just relax. And he says this each time, whether at each stage, and you have to assume that there's a deepening process involved in letting go into space or emptiness. And indeed that's what we teach in the Awakened Heart Sangha. When we teach formless meditation, the idea is you start with some rough understanding or some kind of intuitive sense of what that might mean, and over time that deepens and clarifies through the various instructions you receive and through your own experience in meditation. So it's exactly the same here. So although some of the language starts to sound quite complicated, and it looks quite philosophical and kind of something that you could get into intellectual arguments about with yourself or other people, at the end of the day it's just another way of helping us to be more precise and go deeper into what that really means to let go into the space of awareness. What does it really mean? What is it we're holding on to? How the grosser the concept we're holding on to, the easier it is to let go of. The more subtle the concept we're holding on to, the more difficult it is even to spot it, let alone let go of it. And yet the greater the reward. So letting go of some very subtle, deeply held concept, like self and other or time and space or whatever, results in a huge shift in the nature, in the way we see, when we know anything, the kind of knowing, it sort of moves us into a different way of knowing. Whereas the big gross concept like this is my enemy, I have to kill him, that's if we refine that, it's relatively easy to see this is just my thinking. I don't have to follow that through. I don't even have to believe it. There's an immediate sense of relaxation, but we're still more or less the same as we were before. We're still knowing things in the same sort of way as we did before. But that process can become much more subtle until it leads to a point of complete transformation where we transform from being an ordinary deluded being to an enlightened being, from a being that's suffering in endless rebirth in samsara to a being that's liberated and able to act forever to benefit others. So, yeah, it's quite a big shift. This is what we're talking about. So I thought I'd structure this talk around the verse, which is called the Meditator's Verse. Here there's nothing to remove, nothing to add. The one who sees the truth of being as it is, by seeing the truth, is liberated. So this is, if you like, the quintessential Shentong verse. So here there's nothing to remove. So up until this point we've been talking about emptiness as being a matter of dropping our concepts, our confused concepts. So there's a sense in which there's something to drop, something to let go of. So this is the final revelation. Actually, everything that seems to be obscuring our mind, our knowing, is an illusion. So you don't get hold of an illusion and get rid of it, do you? You can't. You just see through it. You don't get rid of it. You don't sweep it away, wash it away, sort of scrub it out. You see through it, and it doesn't need anything doing to it other than seeing. Oh, that's an illusion. So there actually is nothing to give up. And of course, if you're sitting in the formless meditation, there's plenty to give up, isn't there? You're sitting there, and your mind's going here, and your mind's going there, or you're sort of discovering not here or not there, or you have to keep coming back. So all the time there's a sense, I need to be doing something. And in a way you're right. Because if you didn't have the idea I should be doing something, you'd be away with the fairies, wouldn't you? You'd just be sitting there thinking. So at a certain level, you have to notice you are thinking, and you have to notice the thoughts coming in your mind and disappearing again. But at some point, you're going to see through it, and you're going to realise it's the mind itself that isn't separate from the mind that knows itself. So there's nothing separate from the mind to give up. And when you see that, you can relax. And it says, the one who sees the truth of being, so it's the knowing, it's the intelligence or wisdom intelligence that sees the truth. What truth? The truth of what is being. And how is it seeing it? It's seeing it as it is, as opposed to how it isn't. Because we see the truth of being all the time, but we see it as it isn't. So the one who sees it as it is, by seeing, so that awareness or that knowing intelligence that sees it as it is, in that way, only way that you either see it as it isn't, which is a false way of seeing, or you see it as it is, which is a true way of seeing. By seeing the truth, just by seeing it, the truth, as it is, that is liberation. So there is nothing to give up. You don't have to give up anything, you just have to see. You have to see in the right way. So that's why in the Mahamudra tradition the whole emphasis is on the view, seeing. It's a view that is beyond all views. So one kind of view is holding a view, which is always a distortion. And the other kind of view is the true view, which is not holding a view, which is a way of seeing, which is simply seeing the truth as it is, and by seeing the truth, liberated. Nothing to remove, nothing to add. The one who sees the truth of being as it is by seeing the truth is liberated. But I haven't said anything about nothing to add, because obviously we're following this path to liberation because we're intuiting there is a state of being that is liberated, which is free, spontaneous, full of joy, full of light, full of love and compassion, the power to help others. This is the Buddha nature. This is what we're aiming at. And we, at this stage of the path, we sort of think to ourselves, there's a lot of work to do. I look at my compassion, I look at my state of mind, I look at my qualities, and I think, well, if I'm going to get to that stage of, that matches the enlightened Buddha, there's obviously a lot of work needs to be done. And we work on trying to becoming more patient and more compassionate and more loving and more faith, have more wisdom. But it's like we're accumulating or sort of building up this sort of power of goodness, if you like. Yet in the end, that isn't how it is. We already have Buddha nature. We don't actually have to build it up. We don't have to get it. We don't have to invent it or create it. We're already there. And you think, well, hang on, it doesn't make any sense because look at this. Look at me. How can you say I'm already there? And when we look at ourselves, what we're seeing is our obscurations. We're seeing in a way that's a twisted way. We're looking at something that in a way has become obscured. So you say, well, so what? That's just a difference in words, isn't it? But there could be a complete difference in attitude. There could be quite a difference in attitude, because if we weren't already Buddha, we could actually think, well, I'm not like that. I'm kind of a. I've heard people say even that they feel they're a failure, or they're pathetic, or they're no good, or they've got no value, or they're worthless, or people have all sorts of beliefs about themselves, which is a tremendous obstruction. So even if you could just for a moment or two think it's possible that I'm simply obscured, actually what I am is boundless, spaciousness, clarity, openness, all the Buddha qualities. It's just I don't see it. It's become obscured. And if you believe that, then you feel resourced and ready to follow the path. Because all you need to do is to let go of the obscurations as you step by step. You don't need to worry about, am I good enough? Of course you are. Just are you willing enough, really? Are you willing enough to take the journey? And if you are, then, there's nobody who can't follow this path, because we all are from the beginning. We all from the beginning have this Buddha nature. So it's that Buddha nature, if you like, that ungraspable Buddha nature that's known in a way quite differently from the way the grasping mind knows things. And it's empty of any of those things that you might be able to grasp. So it really is marking that contrast that we might say ultimate reality in Buddhism is emptiness. When you're talking about the emptiness of grasped things, they are empty in the sense of illusion. When you talk about emptiness in terms of ungrasped true nature of awareness, it's not illusion. It's what's real. So why call it emptiness? It's a good question, isn't it? It's called emptiness to defeat the grasping mind. Because if you think, there is something ultimately real, you want to grasp it. And that mind that wants to grasp it then gets totally frustrated. Because it can't. It by its very nature, it cannot grasp it because it's only can grasp what it can grasp, and this isn't of that nature. So it's called emptiness because it's empty of illusion and graspable things, or that mind that tries to grasp, when it tries to grasp the true nature of reality, it's shocked, really. It's shocked because it gains its security from knowing stuff, being sure about stuff and holding its views and opinions. And when it realises it's not going to ever know or hold an opinion about its own true nature, it can come through as a really shocking experience, as if suddenly it's even worse than death. It's even worse than like everything disappears. Everything that you thought you could rely on has disappeared, and sometimes it's possible to have quite a strong, shocking experience of that. The initial stages are quite focused on what's false and describing them as empty. And then you rest in that emptiness. But it's still always got that sense of, I'm seeing something false and I'm remedying it with this medicine called emptiness, seeing emptiness. And that gets more and more subtle as you go through the stages. And when you come to the Shentong, you don't do that anymore. It's like, if you're still doing that, you're still in the stage before. You're still in a more either Prasangika or Svatantrika view. Because if you've reached the Shentong view, you're really where we would be if we could really understand DHB. We're really having we're resting in that confidence that we find in our heart when we recognise our nature to be openness, clarity, sensitivity, without any grasping. Then you don't have to negate anything. Even when thoughts come into the mind, they're clarity. They're the clarity of the nature of mind. And when thoughts come into the mind, they're ungraspable. There's nothing there to negate. So the thoughts themselves are demonstrating openness, clarity, sensitivity. They're not something separate from it. So no need to stop the thoughts, because that's how you see them. It's not even a matter of letting them go, because they never were there. They weren't something that was there to be let go of. Another expression is used for that. It's called self-liberated. They're self-liberated. They don't need letting go of. They're never there. Self-liberated means their nature in themselves is liberated. You don't need to liberate them. So you might get a little glimpse of that from time to time. And then you might find you are caught up in the thought and letting go of the thought. And there's still a sense I've got to do something. And then you might just for a moment or two get the sense of, oh, there isn't anything to do. And then the old habits kick in again. But playing on that edge is a good place to be when you're practicing. You will hear people talking about Shentongpas and Rangtongpas. Some teachers teaching their Rangtong and some of the teachers teach Shentong, as if there's some kind of philosophical debate going on, So what's that about? It's usually about some kind of misunderstanding. But from quite early on in the history of Buddhism, there's been a tendency to get into this intellectualization, the forming of views, and then a meditative tradition coming in to oppose it. And then for a time things have got a little bit corrected, and then there's been another tendency to get to scholarly, intellectual, explaining things away, rather than this other way of knowing that comes through the meditative tradition. And it seems to have happened in all the different Buddhist countries. Certainly in Tibetan Buddhism, you get both. You do get this tension between the scholarly, doctrinal commentary or tradition of trying to pin things down, versus the meditative tradition based on experience that's trying to express things in much more experiential terms, I suppose you'd have to say, and not getting caught up in all this philosophical debate and so on. So there is this tension within the tradition, and I think we notice it among ourselves, don't we, as Western Buddhists. Some of us are really interested and keen on learning through experience and meditation, and not really interested in lots of intellectual ideas, and some people who just fascinated by books on Buddhism and more intellectual ideas, even if they don't understand them, which fascinates me. Whereas there's also a very strong tradition of attacking Shentong kind of way of teaching, this Buddha nature type of teaching, as being not Buddhist even. So you will meet that at various times and places, this has been said. Or another thing that's done is to explain Buddha nature in, I would say, Rangtong terms. So rather than saying, they say, yes, we have Buddha nature, but they describe it in terms of, that from the Shentong point of view, would say, well, that's just another view, just another grass-stack view. It's not pointing beyond the thinking mind, it's still the thinking mind. So I just wanted to warn you about that. And in my doctoral thesis I talk about the what I call exclusive Rangtongpas, who think that all you can say about reality is that it's everything is impermanent and conditioned, all dharmas are impermanent and conditioned, and there's the emptiness of that, and that's it. That's what Buddhism teaches. And emptiness is understood in a Rangtong sense, that this is all illusory. That they tend to talk about the Shentong view as being, non-Buddhist, because it's teaching that ultimately there is the Buddha nature. It's ungraspable and therefore can't be negated. So there is an argument going on in the world between exclusive Rangtongpas against Shentongpa. So enough about that. Step into it and become that, for that truth to somehow, to embody that truth, if you like, or to live that truth.